You may have noticed it when you go into grocery stores or supply shops, a tag that tells you if the product you're about to pick up is made in Canada.
What happens when a country does not announce retaliation, does not impose sanctions, and does not issue a single official warning, yet quietly begins cutting off a key American export anyway? That is exactly what is unfolding right now on supermarket shelves in British Columbia, where United States wheat, once a guaranteed presence, is no longer moving. Not because of shortages, not because of quality, but because trust has broken down and consumers have decided to act. For decades, the assumption inside North American trade was simple and comforting. Food would remain outside politics. Geography, efficiency, and long-standing partnerships would protect agricultural trade from political shocks. That assumption has now collapsed. Following escalating trade war tensions, tariff threats, and rhetoric framing Canada as a subordinate rather than a sovereign partner, purchasing behavior began to change. No ban was required. No government directive was issued. Canadian consumers simply stopped reaching for United States wheat and began choosing alternatives. British Columbia may not be a major wheat-producing region, but it is a critical consumption and distribution hub. When demand weakens there, the signal travels far beyond provincial borders. And what looks like a quiet retail shift is already sending economic tremors back across the border to American jobs, farmers, and rural communities. Stay with us, because by the end of this analysis, we will reveal why this seemingly small change carries a far more damaging shock than any official tariff ever announced. What is happening in British Columbia is not a boycott announced with banners or speeches. It is a market correction driven by psychology, trust, and risk perception during a trade war. Retailers across the province began noticing the shift quietly. United States wheat and flour products were not disappearing overnight, but turnover slowed. Shelves stayed full longer. Reorders became smaller. Importers hesitated before placing new contracts. What once moved automatically now required discounts and incentives to clear inventory. This matters because British Columbia occupies a unique position in the Canada food supply chain. It is not a wheat-producing powerhouse, but is a major consumer market and a logistics gateway. Products that sell well in British Columbia tend to move efficiently eastward and inland. Products that stall there rarely recover momentum elsewhere. As demand weakened, the response followed strict market logic. Importers reduced volumes. Distributors delayed shipments. Milling operations adjusted throughput. Freight demand softened. Each step passed pressure backward through the chain. This is where the trade war stops being theoretical. When fewer shipments move north, fewer trucks are booked. When mills run below capacity, shifts are reduced. When contracts become uncertain, seasonal workers are the first to lose hours. None of this appears in headlines immediately. It shows up slowly in payrolls, logistics schedules, and rural employment data. The most exposed group is American farmers in states closest to the Canadian market. For producers in Washington, Montana, and North Dakota, Canada has long been considered a stable, low-risk buyer. Transportation distances are short. Payment reliability is high. Political alignment was once assumed. That assumption is now gone. Farm gate prices do not need to collapse for damage to occur. Even mild downward pressure can erase already thin margins. Operating loans become harder to justify. Investment in equipment and future planting is delayed. The farmer absorbs the shock long before any policymaker feels it. This is the uncomfortable reality of modern trade wars. Political rhetoric travels faster than commodities, and markets respond before governments do. And the most dangerous part is this: British Columbia may only be the first signal, not the last. Stay with us, because next we will expose how this quiet demand shift begins to ripple through employment, export pricing, and the broader United States economy in ways that are far harder to reverse once they take hold. The slowdown of United States wheat sales in British Columbia exposes a structural weakness that extends far beyond one province or one commodity. Modern American agriculture is increasingly vulnerable to geopolitical sentiment, not just physical supply and demand. For decades, agricultural pricing followed predictable drivers: weather patterns, harvest yields, transportation capacity, and global inventories determined value. Political relationships existed in the background, rarely shaping day-to-day buying decisions. That separation no longer exists. When a trusted market begins to hesitate, confidence erodes quickly. British Columbia's shift sends a signal to other buyers that American wheat now carries reputational risk. Once that perception enters the market, pricing behavior changes. Buyers shorten contracts, volumes become flexible, premiums disappear. Even when product quality remains identical, uncertainty forces discounts. Wheat prices begin to move not only with harvest conditions, but with diplomatic tone and trade war rhetoric. This shift matters because it weakens the long-held default status of United States agricultural exports. When Canada normalizes sourcing from Europe or Australia, it teaches the market that substitution is possible. Over time, that lesson spreads. The greatest danger is not a sudden collapse, but a slow loss of pricing power. Once buyers learn they can function without American supply, regaining that position becomes exceptionally difficult. The economic impact does not stop at export pricing. It moves steadily through employment across the agricultural supply chain. The wheat economy supports far more than farms. It includes grain elevator operators, truck drivers, storage facilities, milling workers, port labor, and regional logistics hubs. When demand contracts, each layer absorbs pressure quietly. Truck routes are reduced. Processing shifts are cut. Seasonal contracts are not renewed. Overtime disappears. These adjustments rarely make headlines, but they steadily erode income in rural and semi-industrial communities. For American farmers, the situation is even more severe. They face a double bind. They have no influence over foreign policy, language, or trade strategy, yet they are fully exposed to international backlash. Many producers believe Canada was an unshakable market. Proximity, history, and integrated supply chains created confidence. British Columbia's behavior reveals a new reality. In a politicized trade environment, no market is guaranteed. With margins already thin, even modest price pressure forces difficult decisions. Investment is delayed. Equipment purchases are postponed. Future planting plans are scaled back. Once a farm contracts, recovery takes years, not seasons. What we are witnessing is not simply the impact of tariffs. It is a structural shift in how risk is priced into food trade. Consumer behavior has become an economic weapon, whether governments intend it or not. And that raises a far more unsettling question. If Canada can quietly step back without issuing a single warning, what happens when larger, more distant markets begin questioning their reliance on the United States as well? Stay with us, because next we will examine how this situation looks from Washington's perspective and why the global response may be shifting leverage in the trade war away from the United States itself. From Washington's perspective, trade war strategy has long relied on a familiar assumption. Economic pressure, especially through tariffs and rhetoric, would force trading partners to respond directly. Negotiations would follow. Concessions would be extracted. Leverage would be visible. What is unfolding with the United States wheat in British Columbia does not fit that model. There has been no official retaliation from Canada, no counter-tariff announcement, no diplomatic escalation. From a policy standpoint, it appears as if nothing has happened. And that is precisely the problem. Markets are responding without government coordination. Consumers are adjusting behavior independently. Retailers are adapting to demand signals, not political instructions. This removes the traditional pressure points Washington expects to engage with. In a trade war, leverage only works when the other side reacts visibly. Silent disengagement offers nothing to negotiate against. There is no announcement to reverse, no policy to amend, no statement to walk back. Demand simply fades. For the United States, this creates a strategic blind spot. Economic pain accumulates without triggering a political event. Policymakers may not feel urgency because the damage appears fragmented and slow. But for farmers and workers, the impact is immediate and personal. This is where the gap between policy intent and economic reality widens. Tariffs and rhetoric are designed to signal strength. Markets, however, interpret them as risk. When risk increases, buyers diversify. Once diversification begins, leverage weakens. The wheat case illustrates a hard truth. Pressure does not always force compliance. Sometimes it accelerates exit. Canada's response has been notable precisely because it lacks drama. There has been no public campaign encouraging boycotts, no coordinated messaging from Ottawa. Instead, the adjustment has been left to consumers and businesses. This approach carries strategic advantages. It avoids escalation while still producing economic effect. It allows Canada to maintain diplomatic neutrality while markets do the work. And it protects Canadian policymakers from accusations of formal retaliation. Internationally, this behavior is being watched closely. When buyers in Europe and Australia gain market share in Canada, they gain more than sales. They gain credibility. Long-term contracts follow short-term substitutions, logistics networks adapt, relationships deepen. For global markets, this reinforces a powerful lesson. Reliance on any single supplier, even a historically dominant one like the United States, carries political risk. Diversification becomes not just an economic choice, but a strategic one. Over time, this reshapes trade patterns. The United States does not lose markets overnight. It loses exclusivity. And exclusivity is where pricing power and influence originate. The broader implication is uncomfortable. Trade wars may reduce dependency faster than they produce concessions. Once supply chains adapt, reversing course becomes extremely difficult. What began as a domestic political signal is now echoing through international procurement decisions. The cost is not measured in headlines, but in contracts that are quietly not renewed. And this brings us to the most important question of all. If markets can neutralize political pressure simply by adjusting behavior, what happens to the effectiveness of trade war strategy itself? Stay with us, because next we will examine the long-term strategic risks and unintended consequences that may define the future of United States trade power far beyond wheat and agriculture. The most dangerous consequence of the current trade war environment is not immediate loss, but normalization. Once buyers learn that replacing United States supply is possible, the psychological barrier protecting long-standing trade relationships disappears. For decades, American agricultural exports benefited from an assumption of permanence. Proximity, reliability, and political alignment created confidence that markets like Canada would remain stable regardless of diplomatic tone. British Columbia's quiet shift demonstrates that this assumption no longer holds. When substitution becomes routine, leverage erodes. Buyers no longer fear disruption, they plan for it. Contracts are written with alternatives in mind. Long-term commitments shorten. What once required negotiation now requires reassurance. This creates a strategic vulnerability for the United States. Trade war tactics are effective only when exit costs are high, but every successful substitution lowers those costs. Over time, pressure loses its force, not because partners resist it, but because they no longer depend on it. The agricultural sector is particularly exposed. Commodities compete on margin, reliability, and trust. When trust becomes uncertain, even small political signals can trigger outsized economic reactions. What makes this shift especially difficult to reverse is that supply chains adapt permanently. Once logistics, storage, and processing align with new sources, returning to old patterns requires more than improved relations. It requires rebuilding confidence that has already been spent. The wheat case should not be viewed in isolation. It represents a broader pattern emerging across global trade. When consumer behavior becomes politicized, governments lose control over the pace and direction of retaliation. Markets act faster than diplomacy. They do not wait for announcements. They respond to perception. For the United States, this introduces a strategic paradox. Strong rhetoric is meant to project dominance, yet it can signal instability to trading partners. In response, they hedge. Hedging reduces dependence. Reduced dependence weakens influence. This dynamic reshapes the trade war itself. Pressure becomes less effective over time. The cost of escalation rises while the return diminishes. Industries exposed to export markets absorb damage that is difficult to trace directly back to policy decisions, allowing accountability to fade. The risk is not only economic, it is reputational. Once the United States is viewed as an unpredictable supplier, rebuilding trust requires years of consistency. Markets that adapt away rarely rush back. What began as a symbolic framing of power has translated into tangible economic shifts. Wheat is simply the first visible indicator. Other sectors will feel similar pressure as buyers apply the same logic. And this leads to the final and most consequential question. If trade wars encourage markets to quietly reduce dependence on the United States, What happens to American influence when the next crisis demands cooperation rather than confrontation? The story of United States wheat slowing on British Columbia shelves is not a narrow agricultural dispute. It is a warning signal about how trade wars now function in a world where consumer behavior moves faster than policy. No tariffs were announced, no retaliation was declared, yet the economic consequences are real. Canadian consumers use purchasing decisions as leverage, markets adjusted quietly, and the cost traveled south through supply chains, employment, and rural livelihoods inside the United States. This episode exposes a critical shift. Power in trade no longer rests solely with governments. It increasingly rests with trust. When that trust weakens, even the closest markets become conditional. Proximity offers no protection. History offers no guarantee. For American farmers and workers, the lesson is sobering. They bear the consequences of political language they did not choose in markets they once believed were secure. For policymakers, the warning is sharper. Influence cannot be commanded indefinitely. It must be maintained. The question facing the United States is no longer whether trade war tactics generate pressure. It is whether they quietly encourage partners to prepare for a future without dependence. And that question does not end with wheat. If markets have already begun adapting in silence, how much economic ground has already shifted before anyone in Washington truly noticed? Subscribe for more fact-based global trade and economic analysis.